The session will be recorded, as most of you have just now received the notice. This is just so that we can then share it with others who might not be able to join today but want to get the content. And of course, you will also be getting the recording and also the presentation for today's call. So I'm going to get us started. And first, I'm going to introduce who we are. I think most of you here have already met me either in the sessions we're doing with the briefings or in other ways. But for those of you who don't, my name is Lina Salas. I'm an independent consultant. For the past couple of years, I've worked a lot with the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, supporting communications efforts. But in general, I'm a campaigner, I'm a social scientist, and I mostly work around the fields of climate action, youth, and education campaigns. And today, joining me in this particular session is Beatriz. I'm just going to let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Lina, and hi, everyone. It's really nice to be in the same virtual room as you. My name is Beatriz Luraski. I'm also an independent consultant, and I've done a lot of work on supply chains, on biodiversity, on deforestation and food systems over the last years. In fact, I see some familiar faces on this call who I've come across before. And I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about nature finance.
Thank you, Beatriz. And joining us as well is some more of the team, which if you have joined any previous sessions, you must know some of them, and you have also been receiving emails from them. So Filipa, Isabella, and the rest of the team are joined here as participants today, but also supporting us in stuff like the chat. Like I said, we will be taking your questions or notes via chat, but we will also be sending some clarification notes or links there. So in order to introduce the project, I'm going to go back a little bit in time to last year when we started. This is an initiative that we began in a partnership between the Food, Nature and Climate Dialogue and the International Climate Politics Hub. And the idea of this project is that we can support political content aimed at organizations and leaderships around climate negotiations, particularly on Indigenous peoples and local communities organizations. So in order to do this, we've worked with some of your organizations and other organizations to identify what are your key topics and moments that you would need briefing and support on. And then we have been using the intelligence that comes from the International Climate Politics Hub to build these briefing sessions, to deliver this content, and particularly to talk about how what is going on in climate spaces has to do with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And then we will also be supporting in certain specific moments and actions with on-the-go support, basically on providing more information or more specific information around some of the topics you face when you attend climate negotiation events. So now that I've given you a little bit of an introduction to the project and what's going on today, I'm going to be leaving you with Beatriz to talk about the finance overview.
Thank you, Lina. And you can go straight to the next slide. So again, welcome everyone. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview on the state of finance for nature. So the first thing to say is there's a very obvious need for much more money for countries to transition and adapt to a 1.5 degree world in which 30% of land and seas are protected and restored. So we have a global agreement on climate change, we have a global agreement on biodiversity, but we are still missing very significant sums of money to meet the goals in those agreements. There are huge funding gaps around mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and biodiversity. And we're going to need very large transfers of funds from the global north to the global south. There's also a lot of different opportunities for this to happen and different financial flows that can help meet these needs. One of those is domestic budgets in the global south and tax policies as well. And so far, we are still very, very far from the global sums that we know are required to meet some of these goals. So it's important to note that what donor countries have offered in terms of public financing still falls short of what is needed. And the final point on this slide is probably the most important for our conversation today, which is that access to funding for nature has been very, very limited for Indigenous peoples and local communities for a number of reasons, which many of you will be familiar with. But some of those are the way in which these funds have been designed has often been for large multilateral development banks. Sometimes the scale of grants has not taken into account the needs of communities, and often they're too large. And so this has been a very live topic of discussion over the last couple of years, which has come up in different conventions, in the Climate Convention and in the Biodiversity Convention. And so we want to talk a little bit more about that with you today. Next slide, please. Thanks. So why is 2024 such an important year for finance? Well, firstly, this year is a unique year in that there are going to be 3 COPs happening all within 1 month of each other. So the first one is the UN Biodiversity COP, and that's happening in Cali, Colombia in October. That's going to be followed by the Climate COP in Baku, Azerbaijan in November. And that's going to be followed by the Desertification COP in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And so all 3 COPs are going to be making important decisions about next steps on implementing these global agreements and on how they will be financed. So one of those discussions in the UN Climate Convention is about the new collective quantified goal, also known as the NCQG. And this is basically about the global climate finance target that will replace the $100 billion a year that was agreed in Paris. And progress so far on what that means in practice and how it's going to work has been limited. But we know that countries are talking about orders of magnitude of trillions of dollars and not billions. And some experts have proposed that the sum needs to be in the order of 2.4 trillion. So we're talking much, much bigger sums than what the Climate Convention has been discussing until now. I also want to just take a moment to say what the difference between climate finance and nature finance is. Essentially, climate finance has largely focused on the energy transition. And while we know that nature and land and food systems is approximately 1/3 of emissions, and also has the potential to offer 1/3 of emissions reductions needed to stay within 1.5 degrees, less than 4% of global climate finance has actually gone towards nature. So it's an area where a very dramatic uplift in finance is urgently needed. Another area where there are a lot of live discussions this year and hopefully in the coming years on the road to Belém COP30 are international financial reforms. So essentially, there are a number of crises, humanitarian crises, health crises, environmental crises, the climate crisis, of course, and economic crises that require much more and better designed and faster funding. And the current international financial architecture has not delivered to communities what is really needed. So there are conversations about how to make finance available more cheaply for the global south. And there are some very interesting, innovative proposals in this space. One of these is a global solidarity levy, essentially taxing polluters and making sure that polluters pay. This includes sectors like fossil fuels, aviation, and shipping. And some of you may have seen in the news recently that the Brazilian G20 presidency is for the first time debating, discussing a billionaires tax, which would essentially tax the super rich of the world and help direct some of that money to global goods, including climate and development. So there are some really interesting developments in this space. However, nature is not really part of these discussions. There have been some small examples of progress in recent years with a range of different initiatives. For example, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. There's an improved understanding of the fact that nature is severely impacted by a lot of investments that are harming it. But at the same time, in a lot of these discussions on international financial reform, the role of nature has been either absent or very limited. And we think it's really, really important to make sure that nature is central to these discussions because it plays such a big role in livelihoods, in feeding people. It is an existential basis of our economies. Next slide, please, Lina. So we know that there is money available. In 2022, fossil fuel companies made $4 trillion in profit. At the same time, there are $7 trillion of annual investments across different sectors, including infrastructure and oil and gas, that harm nature, that directly degrade nature. These figures are from the UN Environment Programme's State of Nature Finance report. And this report really showed the huge amounts of finance that go into activities that harm nature and the relatively little finance that is available to protect and restore nature. So there's been a lot of debate about how this might be addressed, and some more interesting proposals that have been brought to the fore by economists and by other experts. There's been a lot of resistance for taxation, but as I mentioned previously in the G20 discussions, there's growing support for some of these ideas. Another proposal was an economist letter in 2023 that suggested redirecting funds from fossil fuels and from unfair colonial debts and from the super rich towards climate and development. And there's quite a lot of support for this. So 70% of people support taxing the 50 most important companies for the same purposes. And we're finally reaching practical discussions about how this could be implemented at global scale. So 2024 is a key year for finance, but nature still struggles to be heard at this big table of financial reform. So next, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about how big these flows are and what the scale of the gap is for nature finance. So $7 trillion a year of public and private investments do direct harm to nature. Meanwhile, the sum of investments that goes to support nature, in this case, nature-based solutions as defined by the UN Environment Programme, is only 200 billion a year. And the same UN Environment Programme report identified a nature finance gap of $542 billion. So essentially, we are investing 35 times more in harming nature than in helping to support nature by protecting and restoring it. And there's a huge opportunity implicit here to redirect existing financial flows in ways that support nature. And some of these flows are very well established and already have a history of use. So one of those is overseas development assistance, aid. Another one is domestic budgets and tax policy. Another one is natural infrastructure, which includes schemes like watershed protection or payments for ecosystem services that are often at national level. And then there are many other emerging financial flows that are not yet very well established and that don't have huge sums of money behind them. But one of those is sustainable supply chains. Another one is reforming harmful subsidies. And then there's carbon markets and biodiversity credits. So a quick note here to say that market-based mechanisms, especially in the voluntary markets, such as carbon markets and biodiversity credits, are very controversial because they have been used to greenwash corporate practices in the past. However, they are one of the many sources of finance that exist. And I think it's important to say this slide doesn't cover all of the possible financial mechanisms. There are many others. There's the bioeconomy, for example, that Brazil has been talking a lot about on the road to its COP30. There are debt reform ideas out there about changing the way the international debt architecture works to support countries in protecting their natural resources and to essentially restructure how the global regime on debt repayment works. And there are also more concrete proposals from countries like Brazil's Tropical Forests Forever Fund, which they mentioned at the last climate COP. They didn't go into a huge amount of detail, but the idea is to provide a fund that would compensate people who protect forest on an area basis and would provide direct payments to those who protect and restore their forests. So access for Indigenous people and local communities needs to improve across all of these different types of financial flows, especially direct funding to nature that governments have a lot of control over, because at the moment, a lot of the direct finance for nature goes through bilateral and multilateral funds. And some of the biggest areas of contention are around which financial flows should be providing the largest sums of finance to help protect nature, and how to make sure that these flows can last and are not just short-term financial flows. They need to essentially have predictable and long-term potential to really change the economics on how we protect and restore ecosystems. And I think I'm handing over to Lina next.
So after Beatrice's amazingly well put landscape, which shows us what's going on in general, which we understand tends to be a little bit pessimistic, we're going to go into some of the lines of funding and how they work. Particularly, we're going to be going in depth into what the government pledges are looking like, what is expected, what can happen, what should be done to push for advancements this year. Then we will be doing the same for philanthropic funds. And then we'll talk more about Indigenous peoples-led funds. So starting with government funding for nature. This year, as Beatriz was saying, we have the Biodiversity COP16 in Cali. And what is going on in this COP is basically the reviewing of what has been going on since the Kunming-Montreal agreement was signed 2 years ago. And in this agreement done in Canada in the last climate COP, the Global Biodiversity Framework established a set of targets, one of which covers a lot of these funds that we are talking about. And this includes, on the one hand, 200 billion per year devoted to biodiversity by 2030, coming from all the different sources, which would include all the types of solutions that Beatriz was talking about and beyond. The second has to do with the pledge on raising 20 billion for international finance per year from developed countries, which again has a lot to do with the idea of needing to restore a balance from global north to global south. And finally, 30 billion by 2030. And then on the other side, we have as well this year, the climate COP, which is in its 29th version and will take place in Azerbaijan. And the last few COPs have had a set of big pledges, big announcements, and also in difficulties in following up with the promises that are made. So this COP, which is referred to a lot as a financial COP, will include nature as part of those broader financial discussions. And there will be some processes of accountability of the pledges that have been done in the past couple of years. So overall, what needs to be done in the next few years, but particularly in these two climate conferences, is first to hold governments accountable on the commitments they have done, to go back to the promises that were signed and get a picture of why they haven't been fulfilled, which is the case for most of them. And then we need to demand explicit text around communities as direct recipients of the funds, because one of the things that has happened in the past few years with the negotiations is that the language around Indigenous peoples and local communities tends to be either a little bit confusing, so not too explicit on how the interaction occurs between the communities and the governments, or it's absent altogether. So one of the important goals to aim for is to make sure that those types of direct accesses exist in a more explicit way in the text, so that that then creates accountability for coming years. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more of the financial landscape, particularly at COP16. As I was saying, what's going to happen this year is basically assessing progress on how countries have been implementing the biodiversity framework. So some of the key discussions that directly affect Indigenous peoples and local communities are, first, the increase in efforts to mobilize resources that go directly to the communities, since particularly the Kunming-Montreal Agreement has an article on effective participation of on communities. Then there's the need to start exploring options for policies and for initiatives that ensure the access to funding. We will be talking a lot about this throughout the rest of the session, but basically one of the largest issues around these financial pledges is on guaranteeing that the funds actually reach the territories. There's a heavy-set bureaucracy and a lot of layers and filters in which the funds get drastically reduced before actually reaching the ground today. And then this is also a very important year to both identify and promote key case studies, displays that the funding has a powerful impact and that it's the way to go. Now, in particular, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund establishes that at least 20% of all the funding that comes into this pledge has to go into conservation actions by Indigenous peoples and local communities. We will very likely this year know how far countries have come in that promise, which again will likely be falling short of what is expected. Now we want to talk a little bit about how some of these funding actions are assigned and how they can be accessed. We know that there are plenty of pledges, plenty of pots where money goes to, and they may work slightly different. However, we have picked two in particular because we think they are very explicit in showing some of the things that happen across the government funding landscape. So the first one is the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, and we bring it here today, of course, because it's going to be very important for the Cali conversations. The main form of access to this fund is that agencies, multilaterals, and governments apply for project grants. So there are ongoing open calls, and they have a ceiling data on how much each country can access. But this is targeted at very large scale projects and mostly, as Beatriz was saying, is reaching directly the governments or the agencies. Now, the main way that Indigenous peoples and local communities can access this funding entails associating with national governments or with large agencies and Indigenous people-led funds. What this basically means is that when working in partnership with the government, there tends to be a problem on follow-through around free, prior, and informed consent. And this tends to happen with government relations that are based not on trust, but on exploitative practices by governments in the past towards communities. So in terms of what would be beneficial and what we could push for in the coming negotiations is on finding innovative mechanisms that give direct access to the funds at national levels. Countries will be presenting their progress on the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, which are known as the MBSAPs in the COP Biodiversity COP conversation. And we know that the conversation around the nationally determined contributions in climate COPs have been consistent in the past few years. So these plans, these action plans, these strategies should be involving directly the introduction of those innovative systems and the way to guarantee that these funds reach communities directly. Now, on the other side, the other example we decided to bring here is the Glasgow Forests Pledge, which was done 2 COPs ago with a promise of funding for forest protection. Now, this has been working slightly differently because it has much, I don't want to say a lot larger access to communities, but definitely more than the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. And it is assigned mostly through grants, with either open calls or invitations to organizations and governments to apply. But then there's another part of this pledge that has been delivered through loans, either concessional or non-concessional, and a very, very small percentage assigned through equity and others. Now, as we said, we will be presenting these examples with some of the ways that communities can access them. And in terms of the Glasgow Forest Pledge, we see that the best way to access these funds is either associating with large national or international NGOs that have the bureaucratic, the administrative capacity to access the fund, or in limited cases to get direct grants. But again, direct grants do have the barrier around demanding huge administrative capacity, a legal status, and some verifiable experience by their standards. So because of this, what needs to happen around the negotiations this year is to have conversations about how to reduce the barriers and how to create policies that lead funds from governments to communities directly, or even from the international pledges to communities directly, to avoid all the way that the funds get reduced in each layer of barriers for access. I'm going to get started now on talking about the other side, which is the philanthropic pledges and funds. But first, I wanted to take a little pause just in case anyone has a question or a comment for this. Okay, then I'll go on. Go ahead, Marianes.
Hi, good morning. Sorry that my internet is not the best at this moment, but I would like to, is this a comment and maybe a question for you about the capacities that the indigenous communities and organization has for sure to receive that kind of resources. So something that from my organization, we're working very hard is to create those enable conditions and skills in the organizations in order to be prepared for administrate those resources. So I think that is something, is a very important argument that the different international institutions and governments always put on the table. So how we can present a common vision and objective and narratives in order to discuss about this, but in a very good way to be in favor of these communities and organizations.
Thank you so much, Marianes. I will talk a little bit more about this when we go into Indigenous peoples-led funds, but we definitely agree with you. There is a need to establish a common narrative of what makes, what conditions make for an organization or a community to have enabling conditions to access the funds, because of 2 reasons. The first one is that this condition, this enabling fact, has been used a lot as an excuse, as you have been saying. Second, because it can be used every year less as an excuse. Communities are taking a lot of actions in order to train themselves, as you said, to increase administrative capacity. So I would say that if you have the makers of these pledges standing in one corner and communities in another, communities have been taking a lot of steps to grow closer. So that's why this is a key year to get the government side of things to come closer to a middle ground, to giving better conditions, easier conditions, or more access to resources that allows organizations and communities to apply for these types of funds. But there is no unified language around this because each pledge has different enabling capacities, and each of the funders surrounding these pledges have different levels of accountability, transparency, demands. And yes, as Filipa says on the chat, we would love to hear if you have more experience on this and want to share a little bit more about that. Meanwhile, I'm going to go into the philanthropic pledges, for which I believe that Maria Inés's comment is even more alive, because when there is government action, often governments use their own policy barriers as justification. With philanthropies, it's a little bit different because in theory, they have more flexibility to act. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the philanthropic funding programs are looking like in 2024, and maybe either Filipa or Beatriz will make some clarifications on the chat. The first one is the Forest 10-year pledge that was done in COP16 around land rights for communities, which is a 1.7 billion pledge. And the report so far has showed that most of the funding is not actually going to the ground. It's being held in previous steps, as I was saying, in layers of bureaucracy. So while the fund was pledged, in reality, the impact that it has had is very limited. But this year, in the climate COP, there should be new advances and new cases of study to display what has gone on with the assignment of those funds. A second big funding program is the one created by the Bezos Earth Fund, which probably most of you know because it came with a big communication strategy, and it made a commitment of 10 billion in 2020, and these are to be disbursed as grants. So what happens with the Bezos Earth Fund is a combination between it being held through open calls and through direct invite, which I'll talk to a little bit more in a minute. COP26, sorry. Then we have the Protecting Our Planet Challenge, which has so far invested 6.2 billion through open calls, but we'll talk again more about this in a bit. Now, what needs to happen this year around these philanthropic programs? First, there's a need to keep demanding accountability for the investments and for their impact. A lot of these funds tend to have these commitments that a couple of years later, they tend to show just that they invested funds, right? So there's a need to disaggregate that information, to have more conversations around how it was invested, where it led, what communities were actually benefited, and what were the impacts of that. So coming this year, most likely some study cases and some need to demand more transparency. Then the second one is to collaborate with these philanthropies, with their pools of funds, to design some innovative paths that bring those funds directly to communities. As Beatriz was saying, some innovative paths are in place, some of them emerging and some of them already with very controversial results. So there's also a need to keep polishing up those mechanisms. And finally, in supporting funding processes that lead to policy change. Some of these international philanthropy pledges are actually not just working on giving funds, but also on using some of the funds to push for policy adjustments, advancements in reality, to make access easier. So a lot of that will be reflected in policy outcomes. Marina says here that WWF is working with indigenous organizations in Amazonian countries around financial models to self-manage their resources. I think it's interesting that you already have some lessons learned, and yes, we would definitely love to have some more conversations around the examples you have. There you have Maria Inés's email as well, in case you want to exchange more information about this. Thank you. Now, as we used some of the government pledges for examples, I'm going to be doing the same here to show you some of the ways in which these funds are allocated and how we can better access this year to them. First, there's the 10-year pledge, which has been assigned so far through funds around carbon markets, through removing financial incentives for forest destruction, and through policy advancement. Now, as I said, some of these mechanisms are quite controversial and are being revised. And one of the interesting things that will most likely come out of the negotiations this year is the revision of these mechanisms, particularly in the cases where there has been the most controversy. Then what access looks like directly for communities is either through carbon market projects or through government established relations. So in the communities where, in the countries where the governments are more progressive towards land rights and have policies in place, a lot of the relationship of access goes directly. But of course, when there is a dependency on government will, communities tend to fall short in certain countries on receiving these funds. And so for the negotiations this year, what the aim should be is in policy implementation and particularly in long-term fund allocation, because a lot of these pledges have very short windows of opportunity and then they close. So there's a need to guarantee that this is a continued effort. The second example that we have brought is, as I said, the Bezos Earth Fund. And so in this case, there's, as I was saying before, direct granting processes where there's a relationship between the fund and the organization or community, and then open calls where they do challenges and receive people's solutions. Now, in this case, access comes either directly, where communities have the opportunity to apply, or they associate with NGOs who have a little bit of a bigger capacity to access. However, some early cases are showing so far limited results. So a lot of what is going to be key in the coming years with this fund is to keep checking up the reports of transparency and of execution to understand if and how much it's actually having an impact on the ground. And in particular, for these climate negotiations, there's a lot of expected conversation around how to get information access, because the funds exist, but oftentimes communities don't know how they can access them, or even if they exist. And then we had the final fund, which was the Protecting Our Planet pledge. This one, on one hand, allocates direct funds to government plans. So that means that the relationship comes from government policies, and again, can have a barrier in cases with governments opposing communities. And they have open calls and grants where they take on challenges. Now, again, what is being expected this year is to talk about transparency, particularly in the cases where Protecting Our Planet has been funding governments, to understand what has happened with that funding. And again, also to demand free, prior, and informed consultation processes for the allocation of these funds. Sorry. Now I'm going to go into the indigenous-led funds part of things, but first I wanted to again stop to see if we have any comments or questions on this. As you see on the chat, both Filipa has been sharing the links to the funds we're talking about, and some reports that show execution and sort of some landmark cases. So I'll just pause for a second to see if you have comments or thoughts. Okay, then I'll go on, but please remember you can still share on the chat anything you want with us. Now, here you may find some mechanisms lacking. Now, we tried to collect some of the cases that are landmarks of the different scales of direct funding, but please, if you have significant cases, if your organizations or regions are working in some funds or mechanisms for funding that we have not included yet. We would love to hear about them and about the experiences you've had. We have selected some to showcase what goes on. In the global initiatives, we have the Pawanka Fund, which I will go more in depth into, and the Shandia mechanism, which is an initiative of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. Then we have some regional funds that have been established by regional organizations to cover needs that span across multiple places. And in this one, we have the Mesoamerican Territorial Fund, which has some interesting success cases that are actually expected to be shown in the climate negotiations that are coming. Then we have the Indigenous Peoples of Asia Solidarity Fund, which was launched in the COP, in the Climate COP last year, and which is now starting to allocate funds to different processes. So one of the interesting things here is to note today in your cases and in the cases of your organizations, which of these regional funds maybe you didn't know about, or maybe now you know you can partner with them to apply for larger funds. And then the third one is the Indigenous Peoples of Latin America Development Fund. And again, all this comes into regional action, so it basically spans across countries. And we finally brought two examples of local funds that are up and running, which is the Podali Fund in Brazil and the Nusantara Fund in Indonesia. Now, a lot of these initiatives are rather new, and they're trying to bypass barriers for direct access. So as Maria Inés was saying, a lot of the excuses or reasoning that has been used in the past few years is around technical capacity and administrative capacity. So these funds are working on having systems in place that demonstrate that the communities have the administrative experience, the record to manage large funds successfully, and the capacity to measure the impact of what is done. Those are three of the biggest things that the different pledges have said are needed in order to give more direct financing. However, we're finally at a place with first case studies and results that can be reported. So a lot of the work being done right now and expected this year is to be able to report on this in the international negotiations and make a case for the need to increase the funding. Now we have brought here a case study with one of the oldest funds in place, which is the Pawanka Fund. And the way it works today is that they don't have an open call process. What they do is have guiding committees that relate to organizations on the ground, and this guiding committee creates the liaison between local organizations and the funding itself. And then the process includes a governance body that allocates the funds, but also that supports organization in the application process. Now, this is one of the places where I think there's a fundamental difference being made by Indigenous Peoples-led funds. And it's the idea that the funding itself provides the support needed to show how the organization complies with what is needed to access it. I'm sorry to the interpreters, I will go a little bit slower. And then the other very significant advancement being made by the Pawanka Fund is that it comes with a unique system for monitoring, learning, and evaluation. This means that while communities have often been expected to provide technical reports that comply with government and colonial standards, funds like the Pawanka are aiming at understanding, learning, and monitoring in a different way, in a cross-cutting way, and that relates to the knowledge of communities. Now, I've brought some of the key results, but if any of you have had experience working with Pawanka or are a part of the Pawanka team, and you want to let us know how your experience has gone or what sort of lessons learned we can expect, please put it on the chat. As I said, there are some results here. One of them is that 89% of all the funds are going directly to the communities. Now that's drastically different from some of the pledges that we have shown you in cases where only about 1% is allocated to communities directly. This fund has awarded more than 400 cases of grants or initiatives. And the system that I was telling you about in terms of monitoring basically keeps traditional knowledge at the center. And this challenges the way funding allocation usually works, because it's not a top-down, north to south kind of pressure, but communities themselves, from their wisdom, creating the cases and displaying their impact. Now, this case shows us something that is common to, in general, the landscape of Indigenous-led funding. First, around the question, which is how to create access for local projects to these funds. And a lot of these funds basically have taken the option of doing open calls. So keeping in touch with these funds, keeping in track when they launch applications is probably the best way to keep connected. However, a lot of these also have direct contact with the organizations to understand how they work, what they need, and how they can create those funds. And then finally, often there are these big pledges that come with grant, open calls, direct conversations, even with the funders, and that require more administrative capacity. So if local organizations or projects on the ground realize that they need additional support in order to apply to one of these big allocations, they can go to the Indigenous-led funds and request support to work together to apply for bigger funding. I think this bit can be a little bit confusing, so if I wasn't clear enough, please let me know and I can clarify. And now what we are aiming for in this year is, as I was saying, first, building the success stories. A lot of the way the conversation goes on in the negotiations is being held back from not being able to show results yet. But as communities gather more and more success stories and are able to bring this to the negotiation spaces, there is clear evidence, and that evidence becomes a huge input to make the case in the conversations where the direct access to funds is not yet priority. And then finally, there's a big need in 2024 to create connections between the promises that are made at the global level and the mechanisms that exist to apply them in the ground. Because a lot of what happens is that these funds get diluted on the path between the pledge being made and the funds arriving. So for now, there's a lot of work on our hands and the hands of partner organizations, indigenous organizations, to kind of create tracking systems that allows us to see stuff like, okay, there was this pledge done in the COP, and this converted into funds allocated to governments. And so then I would have to look up the governments in my region to understand which policies they have in place, how that fund became either a part of a pool for an existing policy or a new policy. And then I have to look deeper into the rules of my country to access the funds. So basically clarifying those paths between the broader conversations and the reality on the ground is a lot of the task at place for this year. And with that in mind, I'm going to be closing off this bit about Indigenous peoples-led funds, and I'm going to go into some messages that we have brought so that you can take home with you around the financial landscape. But of course, again, if you have questions or if you have any comments about this, please put them here or open your mic. And there's a clarification here, interesting, by Filipa, which is that philanthropic and Indigenous peoples-led funds don't necessarily get discussed in the negotiations, right? Because the negotiations happen between the governments. But they do normally have advancements, conversations, calls for transparency at the events where the negotiations are taking place, right? So there's normally side events at COPs, press conferences where funders call to announce their pledges that are not necessarily embedded into the negotiations, but rather there is a different side of organizations taking advantage of the international conversation going on so that their announcements or their talks can have a broader and bigger impact. Now, the first message that we have in mind and that Beatriz brought on very early on is that we need to scale up finance for nature. And this is needed in all the sources that we have discussed exist. And that is in order to meet the global goals that exist today, even while knowing that the goals are not as ambitious as they need to be. So there would be an even bigger need to scale up the finance if we were to come with more ambitious policies. Now, the first way that this can scale up is by reducing the funding that harms nature and advancing the funding that supports nature. Beatriz showed you this sad scale where we have a huge amount in harming funds and a very small amount in funds for solutions. So this scale definitely needs to shift. The second one is that, as Beatriz was saying, nature is not necessarily at the center of the conversations, and it needs to be in conversations on climate finance and on multilateral development bank reform. So these different events and meetings will be key to make sure that nature becomes a much larger part of the conversation than it already is. And then there are some paths to mobilize more funds in the different needs around finance. The first one is in shifting political will in key northern countries, because a lot of these conversations get put to a halt because of that lack of political will. Then the second one is to generate new money. So that means innovative sources that have not been thought of or not been properly established before, and increasing fiscal policy. We talked a lot about taxes here, and that comes a lot into the conversation. Then there's a need to free up fiscal space. So basically relieving countries or swapping countries around their debts so that they have more capacity to receive funds and to allocate funds. And finally, reducing bad money, right? So shifting up the scales, reducing subsidies for harmful industries, creating better market standards for them to have to follow through. The second message has to do with demanding better access, which I think all of you and your organizations have been working around that demand for quite a while. But some of the ways that in this year in particular this can be done is first in advocating for reducing the barriers of access and the ways that they can be bypassed. So far, it's basically been on the side of what Maria was saying. People, organizations, communities adapting to respond to the needs of the funders. Now, this conversation needs to also go the other direction, asking for a reducement in those barriers. Then the second is that we need to guarantee that the Global Biodiversity Fund builds up on the lessons that have been learned, and particularly on designing funds for better access, on not having to correct as we show that it goes wrong, but in creating mechanism from scratch that is more functional. And finally, the Indigenous Peoples-led funds need to start growing and showcasing new studies that show the impact of the funds being allocated in the ground. Now, with this in mind, we wanted to just close with a line by Hindu, our current chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, who has talked a lot about these barriers and the need for change. And she said, "The elimination of obstacles to financial flows is crucial to ensure direct access to Indigenous peoples for the implementation of our actions and programs, to have the ways and means to finance our self-government and to maintain our self-determination." Self-government and self-determination have been a lot of what we have covered through this call, and we understand that in some ways the landscape looks a little grim, but we also believe that we have seen some paths in which this can change and in which the system can grow to increase and improve access. Now, with that, I'm going to stop in our general conversation to give you some time for feedback and to let you know, we have some resources at hand, like the ones we shared on the chat. Filipa and Isabel, I have sent you a survey on the chat for some feedback you may have on the session and our future sessions. And I'll stop sharing now just to listen to any thoughts or questions you may have. Yes, Maria Inés.
Thank you so much. It was really insightful to hear from you the experiences and the thoughts, the ideas that you have for negotiations in COP16, but in the informal part as well of COP16. Something that I think is super important for our jointly work is to think about the opportunity that this COP is giving us in terms that they have two main, the presidency has established two main messages. One is making peace with nature. So what that means from indigenous perspective and what that's mean in terms of finance, that kind of conservation in indigenous territories. And the second one is about people's COP. So what that's mean in terms of human rights, but not only human rights, but the cosmovisions of those populations and what we can establish different narratives to support their voices, but not only their voices, but their real participation in different scenarios. So that I think those are a huge window that we have to take as an opportunity.
I absolutely agree with you, Maria Inés. There's a unique chance, and also since the focus of this briefing is not COP16 but a little bit more broad, we didn't mention it, but one thing that is important to note is that in general, biodiversity COPs have more open spaces for conversation and negotiation with communities. Climate change COPs tend to be a little bit more closed off, but biodiversity COPs offer more space. And so I would love to also take Maria Inés's comment to let you all know that we will be doing briefing sessions specifically on these events. So for both the biodiversity and the climate COP, we will have additional briefing sessions where we can go more in depth into what is being specifically discussed in those moments. Gabriel.
Mari, buenos días.
Buenos días, Gabriel.
Bien, se escucha bien. Bueno, compartirles en la oportunidad de poder tener esta conversación, este intercambio, que nosotros tenemos en el territorio, actualmente en Argentina, en los territorios indígenas, un nivel de conflictividad muy alto, donde de alguna manera el acceso a los fondos se ve como puesto en segundo lugar ante las emergencias, pero a su vez hemos tenido unas reuniones recientemente con diferentes organizaciones indígenas de aquí de Argentina, donde se hace importante también, porque una de las decisiones actualmente del gobierno argentino, de la nueva gestión, es promover un desfinanciamiento de un montón de áreas estratégicas. Han desaparecido institutos nacionales donde han expulsado o han dejado sin trabajo o sin la posibilidad de continuar sus fuentes laborales, pero a su vez también nos ha implicado, por ejemplo, no poder culminar o terminar la ejecución de fondos internacionales, ¿no? Hace una semana hemos podido retomar una relación con la Dirección de Bosques Nacional en estos días, con por lo menos una pequeña sorpresa de la relación, que es que hay una continuidad. En Argentina hay una ley de protección del bosque, y también en Argentina hay una ley de biodiversidad y una ley que establece también como normativa nacional el protocolo de Nagoya. Entonces, comentarle esto, ¿no? Que hoy estamos en un momento, en una bisagra muy importante, pero el punto clave de compartirles y de consultarles a ustedes, si ustedes ven este panorama también, es que nosotros estamos muy preocupados por los tiempos en que se accede a los fondos por parte de las multinacionales y los tiempos en los que accedemos nosotros. Por ahí puede ser una forma directa, está bien, eso puede haber formas directas de acceso, pero de igual manera los tiempos son realmente terribles. Nosotros, en donde yo me encuentro, es una provincia específicamente en Argentina. La legislación nacional hace que las provincias tengan las facultades sobre los recursos naturales, y se está avanzando sobre grandes emprendimientos. Hablamos de miles y miles de hectáreas, cientos de miles de hectáreas, en condiciones de distritos mineros totalmente expuestos y con regímenes de inversión que liberan de presiones, porque dicen que las normativas locales no estarían, deben ser dejadas de lado al momento en que esa inversión sea considerada posible de ejecutar, ¿no? Esos tiempos son muy rápidos. A decirlo muy concreto, hemos visto instalar un parque solar de 200 hectáreas en un desmonte en menos de 3 meses. Pero aparte de eso, el desmonte se llevó a cabo en una semana, en zonas donde tiene un alto impacto, pues son zonas que se inundan y son zonas de protección para que las tormentas no lleguen a las zonas más de valle. Bueno, ¿por qué pongo este ejemplo? Porque esa es nuestra preocupación. O sea, estamos no solo el acceso directo, sino la rapidez o las formas en las que se llega a esos fondos, por más que trabajemos con los gobiernos, ¿no? Bueno, eso, ¿cómo ven ustedes? ¿Qué apreciación tienen? Y bueno, y si esto también, no sé qué mecanismos por el momento, pero compartirles en un principio la preocupación, ¿no? Ojalá que pudiéramos tener, o la idea de venir acá es poder generar alguna respuesta en conjunto.
Gabriel, gracias. Te voy a responder en inglés para que nuestros intérpretes puedan hacer todas las traducciones. You raise a very important question, and to us, it's been very telling that the places where governments come to more regressive policy and to policy that opposes community, they have so much power to block funds, right? So changes in governments tend to really impact the communities and their capacity to act. And that's why some of the bits that we were saying had to do with making sure that those big funds that are pledged internationally don't always have to go through the governments. So I definitely think that when a government has regressive policy, it's a big challenge for civil society. I personally believe, on one hand, on using all the available mechanisms around lawsuits, creating complaints to the international system, going to the international agreements that governments have signed and demand laws that comply with them. But I also think the other side of the conversation is, well, there is a reality. And when governments tend to favor corporations, there will be reduced funds. So in that case, the other line to work with around the negotiations is making sure that funds don't always have to go through governments, right? That these funds can be allocated directly to bypass the cases in which policy is opposed to the interest of communities. But I don't know, Beatriz, if you want to give any additional insight on that.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Gabriel, for sharing this with us. Much solidarity to you and your community. I just wanted to say one more thing, which was that Lina just mentioned the different ways you can put pressure on different parts of the system, and also trying to design funds that don't always have to go through governments. But one other thing to add is that often there are international corporations involved in these projects that are susceptible to international pressure. And this can highlight the importance of international campaigns on international companies that have direct impacts in communities and in landscapes. Sometimes these things happen very quickly, and it's difficult to get the information out into the public about them. But I think we've seen some examples where, when there is enough international outrage about specific projects, it can help create the conditions to either slow them down or to reassess how to minimize damage. And of course, ideally, we wouldn't be in a situation where we're just constantly trying to minimize harm. We want to be in a much better position of actually getting money where it is needed and being able to run projects that benefit people and benefit nature. But unfortunately, the reality in many territories is trying to fight the worst projects. Yeah, over to you, Lina.
Thanks, Beatriz. And Gabriel, I think an interesting case of what Beatriz is saying is the Forest Act, which is a bill being passed in the US, which basically states, if it gets approved in all the states, that the state cannot import any any products that come from deforestation, right? So that's a way, and that's been created through pressure. That legislation exists because citizens, organizations pushed not only the governments in the South, which tends to be difficult, but they pressure those who enable market access, right? So these big governments have a way to force corporations into better behavior. And that's kind of the aim, to create this actions around how those who are importing the byproducts of what goes on in the global South can shift their practices. Beatriz, you were going to say something else?
Yes, one more thing I wanted to add in response to Gabriel's comments was that I think being able to expose how governments and companies are driving activities that are just harmful and unacceptable is really important, because I think there's a lot of potential for public responses, and this goes back to the point on information and campaigning and the public outrage. But when there is international investment involved in projects, being able to land a story on the front page of a newspaper in the country where the investors are based, or finding out how the money is flowing into territories and where it originally comes from, and if that's coming from a specific place, and who knows, in the UK or somewhere in Europe, targeting the people behind that can be very effective, because ultimately nobody wants to be associated with really bad environmental outcomes and bad impacts on communities. And being able to talk about that in a public way and identifying the people and entities responsible for that can go a long way. And while I have the floor, I just wanted to quickly address the question in the chat from Shinji about funding that goes beyond strictly environment nature for Indigenous people. So you're saying, little funding for topics such as Indigenous education and health and others. Do we know if there are environmental funds considering a broader strategy to include these topics? That's a really good question. I have focused very narrowly on outcomes for biodiversity and nature, but maybe Nina might be able to add something, because we covered a few specific Indigenous people-led funds in this presentation that probably also go beyond strictly nature.
Thanks, Beatriz. So to answer that bit of your question, Shinji, I would say that most open calls and grants would allow for opportunities to include health and or education as part of the conversation and on the fund. But the way this needs to be done, since we're talking about climate funding, is how they connect, right? So one of the ways is, for instance, in pushing for legislation on health issues related to climate change. We now know that mercury pollution in the waters where there's mining action has negative impacts on health. So you could create projects around changing legislation to protect human health. There are some interesting successful cases of this. For example, in Colombia, there's the declaration of some rivers as subjects of rights. So that means that they have a right to health, and that you can fund projects to protect that health of the river. So that's one path. which is shifting legislation so that it includes, or there's also other countries that have fought for including environmental education as a formal part of their education systems. Now that's funding climate education through climate projects. The other way, that is not legislation but fund-led, is in creating projects that work around these matters connected, right? So you would say, okay, I want to apply for a fund to impact the way the health system is run in relations to climate stuff, right? In terms of attending populations that have been negatively impacted by climate change or biodiversity loss. And so that way you can include the health or the education component within your projects. So yeah, for me, it's those paths, including these cross-cutting matters in the legislation and including them on the application for grants and funds. Filipa has sent one example. But yes, I agree that these are small amounts of money. In general, the climate funding is already super limited. The nature funding is even more limited. And then aspects of like health, food sovereignty, or education are even more reduced within the overall picture. And so since we have gone a little bit over time already, and we have taken your questions, I just wanted to take the time to close off this session. Once again, remind you all that we will send you the slides. We have sent them already in multiple languages, and then we will also be sending this recording. And finally, to let you all know that just as you joined our briefing today, you are definitely invited to join us for future sessions. We will be doing some briefings on mineral transition, critical minerals for transition on COP16, COP29, but we will send you all the information in case you don't yet have it for all the briefings. So once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your very valuable input and questions, and we hope it was useful for everyone, and we will hopefully see you soon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.